Welcome to Conversations with the Planets with Lori Kaufman and Alicia Sielheiser, a podcast that roots the wisdom of the stars into our lived experiences here on Earth and weaves the power of diverse healing modalities together with astrology. And today we're going to be continuing our Essential Dignity series by talking about planets in detriment. And we have our good friend Hannah Piper Burns back on with us. So welcome, Hannah.
Hi, thanks for having me back. These are always so fun.
Yeah, we've had Hannah for
Yay.
several episodes, so we'll link those down below if you guys want to
Several
go
many.
check
Yeah,
out the others, and we're just happy to have you back.
happy to be back.
Yeah, and so then digging in, essential dignity is a way of assessing how strong and resourced and effective a planet is at bringing about its significations in the birth chart. And we started this series by talking about planets in domicile who are in their own signs. And then we've also released an episode talking about planets in exaltation. And so now we'll be talking about planets who might be struggling a bit more with their dignity by starting by talking about planets that are in what's called detriment or exile. And that is when a planet is in a sign opposite its rulership. And so we have Saturn in detriment in Cancer and Leo, opposite Capricorn and Aquarius, where Saturn rules. We have Jupiter in detriment in Gemini and Virgo. We have Mars in detriment in Libra and Taurus. We have the Sun in detriment in Aquarius. We have Venus in detriment in Scorpio and Aries. We have Mercury in detriment in Pisces, as well as in fall, which will be the next episode we record. And then Mercury is also in detriment in Sagittarius. And then the moon is in detriment in Capricorn. So, what it
Nice.
means, thank you. I did not have that written down in front of me. That just came out of my brain. But
Nailed
Good
it.
job.
what um but what that means is if a planet in domicile has access to the resources it needs to carry about its significations, like Venus signifying love and Venus in Taurus or Libra having resources that can bring about love and beauty and connection, then when a planet is in detriment, they have access to resources that are very foreign to them. Like Venus in Aries is given a knife. She like wants to go cuddle and make friends, but she like needs to fight, right? And so it's planets having a lot less resources and a lot less support to bring about their significations and having to report to a planet that rules that sign who has very different significations, right? So if Venus is in detriment in the signs ruled by Mars, because Mars wants to separate and differentiate and assert and take action and do a lot of things, and Venus wants to lay back and relax and feel connected and enjoy beauty and bring things together. And so when planets are in the signs that are opposite their rulership, they're very, very far from their home. And so it can make it a little bit more difficult for them to do what's kind of traditionally expected of them. But it can also bring about a lot of opportunity for the planet to express itself in really creative and nonconformist ways as well. And so I feel like a lot of times, like most of us probably have at least one planet in detriment, and that can speak to difficult experiences in our lives, especially related to the houses that the planet rules. So if you have Venus in detriment, then whatever houses she rules in your chart, the topics of those houses might be a little more difficult. So if you have a Taurus 11th house with Venus in Scorpio, your friendships might just be a little more inconsistent or unconventional. There might be some pain and suffering around your friendships in some ways. But you also might just have really unconventional friends or friends who are of a very scorpionic, like devotional nature who express themselves in a little more of a nonconformist way for that planet. Yeah, so that's just kind of an overview of planets in detriment.
Yeah.
Nice. Thank you for that, Alicia. That was great.
Yeah,
Thank you.
perfect.
Shall we start at
Yeah, should
Saturn
we
and
start
move
going in
in?
order?
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think I have anything else to add.
Beautiful.
So, Saturn?
So yeah, Saturn is in detriment in Cancer and Leo.
Mm-hmm.
So it's both the lights domiciles that
Mm-hmm.
um, where Saturn is in detriment. And when I think about detriment, it's so interesting because it's like again, it's the opposite of being at home. So it's like learning how to do the dance backwards or something.
Mm-hmm.
Like you're having to learn the other person's part. And it has I find that we can unpack a lot of the dignity significations by thinking about the differences between the planets. So like Saturn being about not belonging in so many ways, and the lights being about belonging in so many ways, in a solar way, in a lunar way of belonging, and Saturn being sort of about the edge, and the edge walker
Yeah.
kind of feels like the jumping off point for me.
Yeah, and I feel like there's a lot to say about like visibility too. Like you can't not see the sun and the moon, right? Like you can't ignore the sun and the moon, but you can not see Saturn pretty easily.
Sure.
So, especially if you don't know what you're looking for. Um, so I think there's just a lot to be said about how like Saturn has a much easier time hiding, or being part of the background, or being very like internal or hidden, or like not seen, not known. Whereas the sun and the moon are so seen and known and are unavoidable, and you can't ignore them almost.
Yeah, and it makes me think of how Saturn rejoices in the 12th house, and that's a
Right.
place of isolation and being alone and being seen but not wanting to be seen, which is
Sure.
also reflective of Saturn in Cancer and especially Leo, because Leo is such a bright, sparkly, like Leo is, there's a spotlight wherever Leo is. But
Yeah.
yeah, and then part of the significations of, the 12th house comes from the fact that Saturn rejoices there. And so Saturn feels joy when she can make you feel lonely and when she can make you feel isolated and when she can make you feel separated. And so that sensation of belonging or being, also the fact that the luminaries are so associated with light. I mean, life, which is
Right.
light, like life is
Well,
light is
yeah,
life.
both.
Both of those,
Both
right?
of
But
those
like
things.
Yeah.
the sun, like plants can't exist on this planet without photosynthesizing from the sun, and the moon is the matrix that allows all life to come through. And then Saturn, especially in ancient significations, signifies death and endings because Saturn is the last planet we can see with the naked eye. And so until
Yeah.
the 1700s, it was the end of the solar system. And then, the telescope, we discover Uranus and the solar system doubles in size. But for most all of human history, right? Humans have been around for what, hundreds of thousands of years looking at the sky, making meaning. Saturn was the end. Saturn is death. And so then there's like this life affirming quality that Saturn has to do in Cancer and Leo that would be very foreign to what she would prefer to be doing.
Especially when there's
Yeah.
sort of a cosmic parenthood of sun and moon, and like the idea of Saturn is eating the children. So like instead of continue
Yeah.
again as life has to keep recreating itself.
Mhm.
Saturn is like the eater of life.
Yeah. Well, and it's like anything you have to do for survival too.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So then do we want to maybe parse out a little of like what Saturn in Cancer versus Saturn in Leo might feel like? Like I feel like so first of
Yeah.
all, this would be a lot of people born in the 1970s would have Saturn
Mhm.
in Cancer, Saturn in Leo, and then also what would that put us in like the mid 2000s? Like some Gen Z would also have this as well.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah, mid to late, I
time keeps
think.
moving.
Yeah.
But I feel like Saturn and Cancer to me is putting boundaries in place in a very emotional way, or you're like, there's this caring, emotional, potentially manipulative Cancer energy where when you need to have structure and boundary, Saturn would prefer that not to be. I have Saturn in Pisces, which is not in detriment, but is a water sign Saturn. And then my
I
mom has
also have a
Saturn in
water Saturn.
Scorpio. And there's
Same.
something so heavy. Like Saturn doesn't rule water signs. Saturn, I don't think she prefers to be in water. Like there's some heavy emotional
Yeah, that's
energy that
fair.
comes through. And especially when it's the lunar Cancer, like caretaking, motherly, life affirming energy. It's just like there's like this pain at having to do the sorts of
Yeah.
things Saturn does that comes through with that.
And a fucked up relationship to vulnerability. Like
Mm,
so much of what the
absolutely.
Yeah.
luminaries are about is like being being able to be vulnerable,
Yeah.
feeling safe being vulnerable, and Saturn really doesn't
Well, and
side with that.
yeah, when I think about Saturn, I think about like the dead of winter. Like I think about Capricorn and Aquarius are like January. Like,
It's not
like
the
it's
solstice.
Icy,
Yeah, it's not.
icy.
Yeah,
right,
it's
it's
not
it's
midsummer.
cold. Right,
And
right.
it's
So
dark. There's not a lot of light that time of year either.
sure. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, and Saturn is just so not at home in those like really bright places. Like it doesn't want to be seen. Like that 12th house. Like I want to be hidden, I want to be isolated, I want to be quiet, I want to be icy, right?
Hmm.
I want to be
It doesn't want to
icy.
be melted.
And
I want to be
Saturn wants to be
dry.
consistent, right?
Mhm,
Cancer
dry.
is like so fluctuating with the moon, and the things that Saturn is in charge of do best with consistency and reliability.
Sure, sure.
Very true.
Which the sun does have some consistency and
This is
reliability,
true.
And I
but
feel
differently.
well, and it's interesting, like we can unpack the fire versus water again, and like the
Yeah.
fixed versus cardinal kind of aspect of it.
Mhm.
But there's also this like relationship, I think, between the Saturn and the moon that I think Alice Sparkley Cat has done some unpacking on in their book Money Magic, but there's like the 28-year cycle to 28 days. And I feel like something that Capricorn and
Mm,
Cancer both have in common is sort of a nostalgia, like a melancholy and
mhm.
a longing.
Mhm.
Um, so do with that what you will. But there's it's like Leo has the consistency of the sun, but the visibility is uncomfortable, and
Yeah.
the moon has the melancholy of Saturn, but not the consistency.
Well, that's actually really interesting you bring that up too, because I was actually just thinking about this recently. But it's interesting to me that the progressed lunar phase
Mhm.
and the Saturn cycle do kind of line up,
Sure.
right? It's only like a year ahead-ish. Because it typically you have your progressed lunar return
It
around
like
27.
it like sets the stage for your Saturn
Right, like it
return.
happens
Yeah.
right before your Saturn return. And that's something I think about all the time and talk about all the time is how like that progressed lunar return and then that reverse nodal return that happens that same year kind of just like sets you off into your Saturn return. And I almost feel like that I've been talking a lot lately about the Hanged Man and death cards in tarot and how like the Hanged Man is a surrender, whereas death is like not the actual scary part, like the hanged man is the scary part, like the surrender before the release, before the death, because death is just rebirth. And that's kind of what I was thinking about with that like progressed lunar return and the like reverse nodal return kind of happening right before you set stage into the Saturn return, because like Saturn is death. And yeah, I was just this is kind of a bit of a tangent, but I was just thinking about how the those other two things happening at 27/28 and then shifting you there is that like kind of hanged man energy of like, okay, here's the surrender, here's what you need to let go of. And I do have my Saturn in Aquarius, so it is very well placed, but I really argue that like 26, 27 were so hard for me. And then by the time I like actually shifted into my Saturn return, and when it went exact at 29, like that felt great, but I had to like let go of so much
Mm,
first before being able to get there, and 27 was just such a hard year. It's also when COVID happened too for me. So it just was like everything just kind of felt like it crumbled down like dominoes. But then, 28 was all about rebuilding. And I've seen that play out for a lot of other people too. And so that's kind of how I've been looking at it too. It feels like those cycles are very similar, that they coincide with each other. It's like learning who you are and then surrendering to the death that comes with Saturn, if that makes sense.
Interestingly enough, that 27-ish year coincides with your node reversal. So,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
like,
that's what I said too.
yeah, sorry. I
Yeah.
missed that.
I
And
missed
it is,
that
it's
too,
interesting
actually.
that the sun and the moon, it's like the
Right.
sun and the moon's
Mm-hmm.
Cross. Yeah.
The relation,
Yeah.
and I believe it's your 27th birthday when the moon should be reflective of your natal moon in your birth
It
chart. I would have to
is.
look at more,
Oh,
but I remember my
wow.
27th birthday definitely, like the sun's in Scorpio like it always is, and then the
Mm,
moon was in Pisces, and I remember going out, which is where my moon is, and I
Hmm.
remember going out and looking at the moon and that exact like almost waxing gibbous phase that
Yeah.
existed when I was born and being like, that's me, that's my moon, and that happens every 27 years. I believe
wow.
I haven't like fully verified
Yeah.
that with a bunch of charts, but and then that's
It
connected
is
to your
something
nodal.
like
I'm
that.
sure there's some math about nodes and moon phases that like some nerdy astrologers are like, yeah, exactly. But it is interesting. It lines up with your nodal reversal too.
Yeah, right. Like those things like all just kind of coincide and happen around like the same time, which is so interesting. Like the end of your 20s are such a weird time.
Pivotal,
Feels,
big transition.
yeah, it's just like you get hit by so many big transits kind of just at once.
And interestingly, the 27 Club, which is
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
the, you know,
Yeah.
celebrities that pass away at 27, like,
Hmm.
there's something there about visibility and being
Yeah.
allergic to visibility in a way, or like not being able to um, handle that visibility, which makes a lot of sense. Like, we're not really built for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, and
Yeah.
Saturn's the soil, and there's so much
Hmm.
that happens underground with like agriculture and plants growing and all of this life that happens that does better without being seen. There's a lot of
Yeah.
processes that have to do with Saturn that really are better if you don't shine a light on them.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah. It's definitely not the flower.
Yeah,
yeah, and
constant
then
exposure is not healthy.
thinking about like
Mm.
Saturn and Leo, one thing that was coming to mind for me was last summer I planted all these like giant sunflowers
Hmm.
and I didn't give them any structure. And sunflowers are just so Leo. Like, I mean, first of all, they're sunflowers, but then the fact that their heads, which is the botanical term for the type of inflorescence that a sunflower has, is a head, and their heads grow so big that they fall over if you don't give them structure to hold them up.
Yeah.
Mm,
And witnessing that in my garden last year just gave me like so much to reflect on of the relationship between Leo and Aquarius and how you can
oh my
like grow
gosh.
so
Hmm.
big and have your ego and like your beautiful flower and like all the
Yeah.
Leo, but if you don't have the right structure in place to hold it up, you'll fall over. And I feel like there's a place to reflect on that as well with like what about Saturn and Leo? And it just makes me think of like all of the ego that can come through and
Yeah.
all
The
the
ego
like
death.
yeah, the individuality and wanting to assert yourself and like be yourself and have a personality that Leo would like express yourself. And then like if there's too much Saturn there, it just, I don't know, I get an image of like an ugly boardroom with like a lot of like guys trying to jostle for power or something. It's
Yeah.
like
Mm.
very Saturn and Leo to me.
Yeah. Well, and I was
Glengarry, good fun,
recently,
Ross.
yeah, I was recently talking to somebody about like the difference between, not that I like how modern astrology always twists it into like the evolved and the unevolved version of each sign. But she kind of like asked me that question. And I was like, well, I feel like Leo at its like most immature is this like Leo that's like me, like give me attention. Like we all know a Leo like that, right? Who like needs the spotlight all the time and like doesn't like anybody who's like challenging them, right? They're gonna shut you down right away. But then that other side, that like really beautiful manifestation of Leo is the sun, right? And the sun like shines a spotlight on other people too. Like the sun is bright, but it's so bright you can't necessarily look at it, but it can shine a light on others.
Mm-hmm.
And so that like really beautiful manifestation of Leos is like that duality of being able to have your own artwork or your own whatever you're doing, but then to shine a light onto other people's too, so that everyone can build up together. And I think that's such a
Mm-hmm.
beautiful thing. And you know, I'm ruled by the moon, so I love being around Leos. I need them or I won't be seen. But, you know, there's like this thing that I've been thinking a lot about with that like Leo Cancer sun moon energy.
Whereas Saturn is like the uh Saturn's a hater.
Right. Right,
Saturn
exactly.
Saturn says
Saturn
no.
yeah,
Yeah,
Saturn casts aspersions.
right.
Mm-hmm.
Speaking of being a hater, I think this is so funny. The second we started talking about Saturn being in detriment in Leo, my cat Leo just turned around and like he's facing the other direction. It's so funny. He's like, no, I don't like this.
And he is a Leo, so he's like, oh,
Mm-hmm.
Saturn.
True.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. He's an Aquarius moon too, so
Mm.
right on the
Well,
eclipse, baby.
should we do Jupiter and Gemini and Virgo?
Yeah.
That's, we've got Jupiter
This
and Gemini right now.
we do indeed.
We do.
The way I always think of Jupiter and Mercury's relationships, because Jupiter
Yeah.
is in detriment in Mercury signs and Mercury is in detriment in Jupiter signs, is
Yes.
Jupiter is like such a big gaseous like gas planet who just wants to like
Mm-hmm.
look at the big picture and blow things up and expand things. And like I have a lot of very strong Jupiter energy, and I have Jupiter and Sag with a lot of planets in Sag and Pisces, and like I'm really good at looking at the big picture, like summarizing things, or like
Mm-hmm.
just, like traveling around the world, and like all these like big things is what Jupiter wants to do. Whereas Mercury is such a small planet, and Mercury gets into parts of the solar system that like no one else does, is like they're
Mm-hmm.
transiting around the sky. And what Mercury wants to do is they want to like get down to the minute detail and break things apart and make sense of them at like the atomic level. And so then when you have Jupiter in either of Mercury's signs, Jupiter then has to get down to that granular level and look at things like very, like I'm not as good at fact checking. Like I'll like make big
Mm-hmm.
statements with my strong Jupiter, and then the more mercurial people are like, where's like the evidence? Like we need the fact
Yeah.
checks, And so Jupiter has to like have a big works cited page when they're in Gemini or Virgo that like they don't necessarily want to be putting together.
Yeah. Yeah, it's like the
Yeah.
deconstruction versus the cohering,
Mm.
It's like Jupiter wants to colonize, make everything the same,
Yeah.
and Mercury is the postmodern, like deconstructionist. Um,
Yeah. Well, and they're all mutable signs too.
Hmm.
And so
mhm,
this is like the only time that that really happens. So
very
there's this like, yeah, that's how I kind of think about them. I also have like no mutable in my chart besides my Venus. So, um, mutable energy is like not something I'm super familiar with, but I also don't have strong Jupiter or Mercury in my chart either. So these are like the two planets that I always feel like I just don't always understand.
I feel like there's so much about knowledge and information that come
Yes.
through with Jupiter and Mercury, and in different ways.
Yes.
Like Jupiter's like this inherent knowing, or this like wisdom, or like I get the vibes, and so now I know. And then Mercury is like I've done all the research and taken all the notes and collected all the information. But they're both
Mhm.
so interested in that. And then just like
Yeah.
mutable signs, if we think about them seasonally, mutable signs are the signs that occur when seasons are changing. So like
Yeah.
Gemini is like, is it spring? Is it summer? Like, do I need a jacket? I don't know. I got to be flexible. And it's like, as things are changing, and there's this very like, especially like, there's just a lot of Pisces going on with Saturn and Pisces and my moon. And I just feel like I'm in like a tide pool. Like, mutable signs can be like, they're not very, they don't have a direction. Like, there's a lot of movement, but they're kind of just like swirling around. Or like, Gemini is the pollinator that's like here and here and just like, that's like the mutable energy, which is great for
Yeah.
information, right? When you're just
Sure.
studying and you're collecting. But if you're doing it in Jupiter's way, that's one way. And if you're doing it in Mercury's way, it's a very different way.
Well, and
Yeah,
again, if
different
you're the
things.
king, you're the law. Like the law is above the law,
Hmm.
and Mercury is like the lawyer that is like arguing the letter or the spirit of the law, whereas Jupiter is trying to sort of embody it.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then I guess also just from a technical consideration, like digging more into like for any planet in detriment, right? When we have a planet in detriment, that just means that they can't do what they signify as like traditionally well as they'd like to, right? And so Jupiter wanting to like be the law and be hopeful and be expansive and affirming and like create belief and have things matter and be meaningful. When Jupiter's in Gemini and Virgo, they have to be a lot more skeptical and like considering like tiny details. And it's just like Jupiter's not able to bring about their significations in their way that's like traditionally like prioritized by society. And one
Sure.
thing that Demetra George talks about a lot in general with assessing planetary condition is like when you have a good house or a planet that's functioning in like a good, strong way, that means that like from the ancient perspective, that it's doing it the way that like society expects it to do. So if you
Yes,
have a very
exactly.
strong
Yeah.
Jupiter, you're able to do Jupiterian things and like the way that is elevated or prioritized or expected by society. And we could record infinite episodes on why there are many benefits to not doing things the way society expects us to, with
Right.
Yeah.
different like harms that happen to different marginalized people and colonization and climate change. And there's so many ways where like doing
Mhm.
things in an unconventional, non-societally expected way can actually be very good. And that's where Jupiter and Gemini and Virgo can come in and kind of like flip the script on what's expected of Jupiter.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Jupiter and Gemini. Well, Gemini is so it's it doesn't like to take things seriously. And Jupiter likes to take things seriously. Or Jupiter takes themselves seriously. They might like they're jovial, known for being jovial, but also like kind of take themselves seriously. And so Jupiter and Gemini, like Gemini is inherently sort of like
Trickster
playful.
energy.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
can border on the nihilistic, which is like again anathema to Jupiter's whole thing. Like Jupiter
Yeah.
cannot be nihilistic.
Hmm.
That's why Jupiter exalts in Cancer, which is like all about meaning.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, like, on a personal level, if you have a planet in detriment, like if you have Jupiter in Gemini or in Virgo, looking at the houses that Jupiter rules in your chart, which would are always going to be Sagittarius and Pisces,
Hmm.
no matter what chart you have. Or if we're talking about Saturn, Saturn always rules Capricorn and Aquarius. And so like planets are always in charge of their domicile signs. They're like, if you're like from an ancient perspective on looking at
Yeah.
hospitality and being a host, like if you own your home, or you own your land and then you have guests who come and you're responsible for the guests who visit your place, and you're also responsible for like even from a modern perspective, we can talk about landlords. Like even if you're away from home, if your plumbing breaks down, you got to fix it because you own that place, and you have stewardship and relationship and you tend to
True.
it. And so Jupiter's always responsible for what's going on in the houses where Sagittarius and Pisces are in the birth chart. And using whole sign houses for this theory and this technique, just because this is like those are the houses that were used, or that was the house
Yeah.
system that was used with this technique by Hellenistic authors. And
Mm-hmm.
so, like, use whatever house system you want, but when you're using a technique to a specific lineage, I think it's useful to at least start by using the house system that the technique was developed in and seeing how it
Yeah.
works and then experimenting. And it can be really useful to look at what houses are ruled by Jupiter in your chart and how, if you have Jupiter in detriment, that might cause some difficulties, some inconsistencies, some delays, some more unconventional manifestations of those topics. So if Jupiter rules your third house, maybe you and your siblings don't get along super well, or your siblings are of the nature of like Jupiter and Gemini, and they're really like nihilistic and skeptical and like a Jupiterian like inverted way, so you can really start to
Mhm.
see planets in detriment showing up in your personal life when you're using house
Mm-hmm.
rulership.
Yeah,
Yeah, great.
totally agree.
Any other thoughts on Jupiter?
Well, Jupiter and Virgo, I mean, we can talk about
Mm.
fall next time as well. But, I think if Gemini is the trickster, Virgo is sort of the, for lack of a better term, like the sort of like, but the sign says you can't. We can't park here. The sign clearly says no parking, and Jupiter is like, come on, come on. It's fine. We're only going to be here for a minute. Like, it's very that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, I
Yeah.
also think of like anxiety. I mean, whenever I think of Virgo, I just think of anxiety that manifests
Anxiety.
in the belly as like
Same.
stomach aches from
Literally same.
anxiety. But especially like Jupiter's so big. Like if you're
Yeah.
trying to chew on these like really big life topics and like what actually has meaning and what do you believe in and like what's the nature of the universe and all these things that Jupiter's chewing on, but you like do it with too much of a Virgo energy, like you're gonna get
Mhm.
a bellyache. Like you're digesting too much. It's like a
Yeah.
Thanksgiving meal and your stomach can't like process all of it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and there's like a little bit of that OCD almost that comes with
Hmm.
that Virgo energy too, which like I think on large scale things, it's just overwhelming. And it just is like, where do I start? Where do I focus? Where do I put my energy? And with Gemini, I feel like it's like almost too, I don't want to say too deep, but like it's almost like
With
too much.
Virgo,
No, with Gemini, I mean.
okay.
Mm.
Yeah, like that duality of both of them.
Hmm. Yeah.
Like, because Gemini just wants to be like trickster, like fun, like let's talk about light things. Let's
Like
talk about
nothing is
fun.
real anyway, so let's just like
Right,
play
right,
around. And Jupiter's like, but
exactly.
things have meaning and they matter and they're real.
Yeah, it's like, no thanks.
Very that.
Which is kind of what I feel like we're going through right now with this transit.
Oh man. Yeah, it's being lit up too and squaring Saturn in Pisces, and now Mars is in
Yeah,
Gemini, and there's a Mercury retrograde in Virgo, and like, yeah, the mutable signs
so
are,
much mutable.
it's a lot going on.
Yeah. Yeah, it's been very sleepy.
Yeah, I've been very sleepy.
Mm-hmm.
Well, should we do Mars in Libra and Taurus?
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Mars.
I feel
I
like,
think
oh no, you go.
me and my Mars. I mean, yeah, when I think of, so I have Mars in Cancer, but when I think of Mars being in detriment or fall, it's Mars being handed a bubble gun, right? Like it's that
Hmm.
energy. It's like what are you gonna do with a little bubble gun when you're sitting up against Mars and Aries sitting there with a real gun? Like you're
Mm.
not gonna win. And so like there's this almost like ability to have to like put down your weapon that wasn't even a weapon to begin with and like learn how to fight. And there's just this like, oh, like I need to learn how to act and fight and move and do these things or otherwise I'm gonna go crazy, right? So it's such a like complicated energy. And I think specifically with Taurus, it's very stubborn, like fixed
Hmm.
earth, right? And when I think about the fixed signs, when I first started learning astrology, somebody started or somebody taught it to me as thinking about each element reacting in a box. And so I still think about that often actually, because like, if you put earth in a box, it's never moving again, right? So that's Taurus. Like it's stuck. It is fixed. It is never going to move. And Mars, which is all about movement and action and violence and all these things, like in a sign that is so stuck, like that's not gonna do anything. So it gets potentially really lazy, or it has extremes, or it like falls from one to the next, or it just has a hard time like finding motivation, or maybe potentially I've seen Mars and Taurus a lot lean into like food, food addictions, or like smoking or anything, because it rules the throat. There's always some sort of like oral fixation almost. And yeah, I see that manifest a lot. And with Libra, I see it manifest a lot as indecision. Or like, cause that people pleasing type of energy comes out. And it's like, well, I don't know, what do you want? Like, that's very like Mars and Libra, cause it's like, it just wants to make the other person happy. So to its own detriment, it's going to put it literally, it's going to put itself down.
Hmm.
And just be like, well, I don't know, we can eat wherever you want to eat. Like it's not going to want a fight because it wants peace. And so when it comes to things that especially don't necessarily matter, it's just gonna back down and just allow whoever else to make the decision.
Especially because Mars rules decisiveness, like as one of its
Right.
Mm.
general significations.
Right.
Because it's
Right.
really easy for us to think like, oh yeah, Mars is the god of war and violence and conflict and anger and
Sure.
irritation and inflammation and infection. But some of the like not so difficult aspects of Mars is our decisiveness and our ability to take action and our energy and drive that motive and our motivation to take action. And it's like what we care about and what we're willing to fight for. And so, yeah, especially Mars and Libra, but either Mars detriment, like you might struggle with decision making
Hmm.
and like laziness is absolutely a very real thing that can come through with people who have Venus ruled Marses because Venus wants to
Yeah.
chill out and she wants to relax and she wants to lie back and just experience pleasure and joy and good feeling things.
Hmm.
And like Mars and taking action and drive, like harder to do when you have a Venus
Yeah.
ruled Mars. And so yeah, not taking as much action, sitting back, letting things come to you, which can also
Yeah.
sometimes, again, it's like when a planet's in detriment, it might be conventionally difficult from like a like traditional societal way, but like there
Sure.
are benefits from having planets in detriment, and it's like having a planet in either domicile or detriment, like there's extra focus on it. I feel like those planets
Yes.
tend to be louder planets in people's charts, which depending on
Hmm.
house placement and aspects and other factors would, be mediated. But it's like I feel like planets in detriment show up a lot of times louder in people's lives. And sometimes like a lot of famous, very successful people have a lot of planets in detriment and fall. And so it's like Mars in a Venus ruled sign might be really good at magnetizing things. Like Venus pulls things in and
Hmm.
magnetizes and receives. And like there, you might have a gift at like pulling things in where it might be a lot harder for you to like go after things in the way like Mars's glyph literally is like the arrow going after, which is hard for Mars to do when Venus is in charge.
Yeah. Yeah. And I definitely get that. And I've seen that play out for a lot of people too. It's like, um, I have a friend who always jokes that her detriment and fall placements are like handicaps, but I actually feel like detriment and fall placements can almost be like blessings. Like it can be an area that like you have to work harder, so you've like maybe learned more lessons.
Hmm. Absolutely. Um, and another thing with Mars in Libra and Taurus in Venus ruled signs I actually lived in a house with like 7 people, and 5 of them had Venus ruled Marses, and it was me
Mm.
and my other friend with Mars and Leo who didn't. And it was just very interesting to kind of observe and witness. Like there were 2 Mars and Tauruses and 3 Mars and Libras. And I feel like one of the positives of a Venus ruled Mars is like Mars is also your passion and what you're passionate about and what you really
Mm.
care about. And there's this passion for connecting with other people and for like
Yeah.
friendship and relationship that can come through when you have Mars in a Venus ruled sign of like
Mm-hmm.
you might not be exerting a lot of energy into like taking over the world or being a star athlete, although you actually might be
You
because
could, yeah.
like depending on other aspects, but like you probably also really care about connecting with people in your life, again depending on aspects and
Yeah.
other things, and like what houses does Mars rule in your chart and whatnot. But like passion about personal relationships definitely can be a like more positive manifestation of that. And then like the conflict avoidance that can come through that
Yeah.
sometimes might actually be helpful for keeping the peace, right? There's
Sure.
times when like we can be seeking out too much conflict, and if someone has too much Mars they can like overdo it with the conflict, and then there's times where conflict is really really necessary to have healthy relationships.
Yeah.
But sometimes keeping the peace is what is actually going to be best for the social dynamics, and Mars
Mm-hmm.
in Venus ruled signs can sometimes understand that better than some other Marses might.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally
I
agree.
love talking about Muhammad Ali when we talk
Hmm.
about Mars and Taurus, because
Yes. Yeah.
here's somebody who was a fighter.
Mm-hmm.
Like, that's what he's remembered for. It's very high up in his chart. It's very angular, like top of the chart. This Mars and Taurus. But he lost the best years of his fighting career to his stubbornness of not wanting to fight in the Vietnam War, resisting the draft. So he was punished by not being
Hmm.
able to box during his. They like banned him from the league. And there's this amazing documentary called When We Were Kings that's sort of about his comeback.
Mm.
There was this fight that they set up between George Foreman, who was like the heavyweight champion at the time, George Foreman of the George Foreman Grill, and Muhammad Ali, who was like coming out of this like forced early retirement, basically. And everybody thought that George Foreman was going to just absolutely thrash Ali. And they had this whole fight plan. It was called the Rumble in the Jungle. It took place in the Congo. And Muhammad Ali won that fight. It was considered like a huge turning point. And basically, what he did was that he wore George Foreman out. He
Hmm.
like just played a very defensive boxing game for round after round after round and let George Foreman wear himself out. And then in like 30 seconds, just knocked him out. And
Yeah. Like playing the long game.
yeah, playing the long game. Like, I like that example because it's an example of a Mars that's not exactly like, we wouldn't call that a weak Mars. None of that feels like a weak Mars. However, again, there's this like over-cultural rejection of his expression, like his
Yeah.
refusal to fight in the Vietnam War. And he famously was like, what has a Vietnamese person ever done to me? Like, I'm not gonna go, no, I'm not gonna go kill anybody. Like,
Yeah.
come on. And just was like, absolutely not. And like, it's amazing, like when you look at old footage of like even, you know, when he converted to Islam, he changed his name to Muhammad Ali, but reporters would like dead name him on purpose. You know, they were just like, they really disliked him. He was very, but he was interestingly like loved by the people. And when he went to the Congo, interestingly, the people of the Congo really embraced him as like the people's champ, whereas George Foreman was. Part of it was that he had a German Shepherd, and the army, they were like seen as cop dogs and army dogs, and so he was immediately sort of put at a distance. But like the people of the Congo really like lifted Muhammad Ali up and he would like go jogging every day, and all the kids in the village would like jog with him. And that feels very much like a lunar, again, like the people. He's the people's princess, you
Well, and
know?
the
He's
moon
like
exalts in Taurus, so there is a lunar energy that does come
exactly.
through with Taurus.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's the lunar exaltation. And so yeah, I think that's like
Mm.
he was not given a bubble gun. He was given speed. He was actually very fast too.
Sure.
But like also he was given patience. He was given
Mm.
stubbornness. He was given, you know, and all of these things aren't necessarily considered Martian
Sure.
traits, but they can be deployed to very high effect. And now he's
Well,
seen, like he's looked back on in this very like rose-colored way, like everyone kind of
Yeah.
exalts in hindsight, but at the time he was extremely controversial.
mm-hmm. And that
Well, it's
makes me
very like tortoise in the hair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that makes me think too with planets, like when they're in detriment, they do still have the modality that they're comfortable with, right? So if Mars
Mhm.
rules Scorpio and is very comfortable in fixed water, Mars is then in detriment and Taurus, but still has that fixed energy. And so there's something that Mars really can do with fixed energy
Hmm.
to good effect when, and I'd be curious, like, what aspects does Muhammad Ali's Mars have, and like what else is going on in the chart to help that, right? Because we always need to hold that in the context of like
Totally.
the planets exist in this ecosystem and this web of
Yeah.
life where they're all interacting, and we're kind of isolating the essence of like Mars and Taurus here. But that's a fascinating example.
And actually, I feel like I was just listening to an astrology podcast episode yesterday where Austin Coppock brought up Muhammad Ali and mentioned that I think it was his Mars in Taurus was conjunct Algol. And there was like a
Mm,
famous picture of him with a bloody head. And
Wow.
because he was talking about how Algol can sometimes coexist with images of bloody heads or like things along
That
those
makes
lines because of
sense.
Medusa. Yeah, yeah. Oh, it was the episode where he was just talking about the Trump shooting. It was the most
Oh
recent
yeah.
was
one.
it the
Yeah.
just August 2024 forecast
Yes,
episode?
yes, yes, yes. That's what it was. I just listened to 4 episodes, so I was like, I don't remember what I was listening. It's just been on in the background at the shop lately. But yeah, it was
Cool.
definitely
Well,
that
so
one.
then another thing that I was thinking of with Hannah's share that I feel like applies to both Mars and Venus in detriment and this like Taurus, Scorpio, Libra, Aries axis is when you have Mars in detriment, that can really show up as a social activist. Like I can think
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
of this couple that I know who I met through the George Floyd uprisings who both have Mars in Taurus, and I have Venus in Scorpio and I'm a social activist. And there is something about like, and again, that goes back to the detriment, like another word for detriment is exile, and like when you're exiled from your home, when you're like sent away and unable to be in your home, and so then you have to go somewhere else where you're very far from what's familiar, you're very far from what you're
Mhm.
used to, maybe you don't speak the language, maybe you're not accepted by the people there. It's like a very, very difficult experience. But then there's also like what can come from kind of being on the margins or being on the outside or having that more exiled away from home perspective. And especially when the place you're in needs to be resisted against because there's injustice, which especially Mars and Libra would really care about, or when there's
Mm-hmm.
things that are wrong and you need social activists, like those people with strong planets in detriment are going to be the ones who will come in and actually like change the world.
They'll fight for you.
Yeah.
Because
Mm-hmm.
those people like have the experience of being left out and
Mhm.
feeling disconnected and all of those things. So yeah, they're going to be more likely to understand and be able to
Absolutely.
help.
I think that's the real turn of planets that are undignified, whether it's in detriment or fall, is like
Hmm.
there's the capacity for tremendous empathy because you understand what
Yeah,
it's like to struggle.
sure.
But there's also, you know, this idea of like struggle being, you identify with struggle so much that like you expect things to be hard, you don't like things to be easy, or when things
Mm.
are
Yeah.
like you
Can
we
make it
talk
harder
about,
for yourself.
yeah, you make it harder for yourself because you expect things to be hard. And like mindset, like we talk about mindset, which is very, it's a simple concept, but it's not easy because when you're privileged and you expect things to work out for you, it's easy to believe that things will work out for you. But when you identify with struggle, like, or you expect, like, and we can talk about this later with Venus, but like when you expect love to be a struggle, for example, then you're going to pursue relationships that aren't, that are turbulent.
Sure.
Mhm.
Because that's what you are like expecting and creating. And those
Yeah.
conditions can be applied to other planetary significations as well. So like with Mars, like if you're expecting to have difficulty making decisions or executing things or differentiating yourself, like you
Mhm.
will.
Yeah. I actually knew somebody who his entire chart, every single planet, I think almost every single one was either in detriment, fall, or domicile, or I think he had one exalted or two exalted placements too. Like his whole chart was like one extreme or the other. And I just remember thinking like, and most of them were domicile and exalted. Like there was only like two that were not. And I just remember thinking like, you are just the definition of a person who was handed everything, like never had to work for anything, just had such a easy time. But then I remembered hearing that he was going through a difficult time and like not handling it well. And I just remember thinking, like, well, yeah, like when your sun and moon are both exalted and then the rest of your chart is in domicile, like, of course, when you finally get to a point of going through a difficult time, you're not going to know how to handle anything. And it's just such a like crazy dynamic, whereas like, having a little bit of balance between them, it's not so extreme, or you can like kind of understand or work with. Yeah.
Yeah. And again, being able to hold it. I think about Mars and Libra a lot as like either the sub or the flirt, like the bratty sub, or like
Yes.
the flirt, the person that's like, okay, well, I'm not going to be able to fight my way out of here, but I might be able to seduce my way out of here. I might be able to like
Yeah.
have your baby to get out of this, or like, to get out of this situation, or I might be able to, um, tell you some stories, or, there's like just different, like the strategies change.
Well,
When you have different resources.
and this
Yeah.
is also making me think, and I think we want to just do a whole episode on planetary remediation at some point,
Well,
Yes.
but just like to talk about it a little bit, like, if this is your chart, if you have a planet in detriment that's difficult, like what are ways you can work with that more constructively?
Mm-hmm.
And really understanding the archetypal nature of like, okay, what is Mars trying to do? What is the habitat or environment that Libra provides? And then where can Mars like do well in Libra? And then where does Mars really struggle? And
Mm-hmm.
then like Austin Coppock did a lecture at NORWAC 2022 about planetary charity
Mm-hmm.
I
that you
love
can
that
purchase
lecture.
from their
Yeah, I was
website
there.
or
Good.
from Austin's website if you're
A
interested.
banger.
But he talks like, and I think
Yeah.
about that actually with my Venus and Scorpio, that for a while I worked in a homeless shelter for women, right? And that can be a way
Yeah.
of remediating. Like if you find a charity that's of the nature, like, a Mars issue could
Mm-hmm.
be like young
Veterans.
veterans, yeah, like helping veterans out or
Mm-hmm.
helping fighters who have like traumatic brain injury, or, you finding something that's very much of the nature of your planet in detriment
Or
and
children
giving.
orphaned by war.
Yeah, absolutely. And then giving like money or time or whatever sort of charity is meaningful for you can help remediate that energy so that because it's going to come through. Like your life is a riverbed for that energy to come through. And so if you create a structure to try to have it go through in a certain way, that can potentially help minimize it coming through in ways that might be really detrimental to you. Like actually in the August 2024 astrology podcast forecast, Austin Coppock also talked about like some astrologer who knew his student was going to have a difficult Mars transit to the point where the teacher was like, he might die. And so he threw a hot coal at the student in class and made the student like catch it to try to redirect the energy so that that would be the Mars transit. So like
Mm.
you can't escape your fate, but you can work with it. And this is like its own, I mean, fate versus free will. Like I
Sure.
just said that I may change my opinion in 5 minutes on fate versus free will. Like it's a constant like nebulous
Yeah, yeah.
conversation that astrologers are always having. And we want to do like a whole episode on remediation at some point, but just to like get people thinking about different ways you can constructively work with planets in detriment to like
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, like how can you see a difficult thing coming or see a difficult transit or know that there's a difficult placement in your chart and then like just finding different ways to have it manifest in your life. I think about I think it was the astrology podcast where I originally got this from, but they did an episode with a tarot reader like years ago. I think it was like 4 years ago that I listened to it. But she made a comment that like if she pulled the tower that day, she would crawl headfirst down the stairs to reenact falling out of a tower. And like if she pulled the nine of swords, she was like, "Well, I don't wanna have nightmares, so I would go to the grocery store and buy 9 little needles and be like, 'These are my swords.'" And, like, just different
Mm.
ways where you can be like, "Well, I don't want this to manifest into my life, so instead, I'm going to reenact the card so that this is how it's actually playing out." And, I thought about that for years in the way that, like, when I pull my card of the day, if I ever pull negative or difficult cards, I'll be like, oh, well, I'll just go do this instead so it doesn't manifest this way. And I think about that a lot with people's charts too. When I'm doing readings, I'll always give examples or ideas of different ways that they can mediate certain, like, certain things and just like, yeah, here's another example of that, or here's how you can mitigate it and work
And,
around it so it doesn't manifest in its worst possible way.
and embrace it too. Like
Totally.
Ferdinand the Bull is Mars and Taurus. Like doesn't
Yeah.
want to go to fight in the bull ring, wants to pick flowers in the field, and like finding those role models, and like, or I think of Mars and Taurus as like a pitcher plant or something that's like it's
Mhm.
still receiving, but it's a trap. Like
hmm.
it's power, it's like is in the like receiving too hard. um it receives the heck out of you, little bug. So like thinking of ways that nature is perfect, like nature doesn't make mistakes really, or I mean it does,
Yeah.
but like, you know, nature exists in this kind of beautiful system. And when you can see examples of those processes happening in nature, you can see your own processes as something that is perfect in its own way and like contributes to the ecosystem of your chart in its own way, you know? Um, and like, I mean, I think visibility for all planets that are in detriment and fall, because so much of the visibility has to do with being seen negatively, like
Hmm.
trying to control your own image of yourself is a great remediation technique.
Yes.
Hmm.
Totally.
Yeah. And this is also making me think of Lori and I did an episode a few weeks ago with Lori's friend on self-care and astrology
Mm-hmm.
Hmm.
and how astrology, and the more you understand your chart, it can give you permission to be exactly who you are. Like the more I've learned about my Venus and Scorpio, the more I feel
Yeah.
empowered to like be who I am, even though that's not
Yeah.
actually like what I see on like saw what I saw on Disney Channel growing up, or what I see
Mm-hmm.
in, like the
Sure.
tabloids, or certain ways of how things are represented as what's expected of me. And so when you know what your planets are doing and what their nature is, and then you can just really embrace that in a way that's on your own terms, and like, okay, well, if this is how my energy is, how do I work with it in a way that feels like the most empowering and enlivening for me, even if, some of the cards we're dealt we might not have asked for, and that's kind of life too, you know? So it's just like
Yeah.
embracing who you are through your detriment planets can be really, really healing.
And those are just like so nuanced too, like that it just adds so much character to who you are. And like, I don't know, I love detriment placements, but I have people come to me all the time who know like enough about astrology to like worry about things like that, but not enough to like understand actually what they know. And that's a
Interesting.
question. Yeah, that's a question I get all the time is like, oh, my whatever's in detriment. Like, how do I how do I live? You know, it's always so dramatic. And it's like it's just unresourced. Like,
Mm-hmm.
you know, it's not given everything, but like just because it's not given everything doesn't mean it's not worthy, you know, or it's like it has so much more character. Whereas like my friend's example, like if you have a chart where everything's in domicile or exalted, like that's kind of not that, you know, they're an annoying person to be around, but if they're always given everything and never have to go through hardships, they're not very interesting. Like there's just not much going on.
Mm-hmm. There
So
was
there's nuance to it.
There was a post I reshared on Instagram recently that was like astrology will work so much more effectively if we stop thinking about things as good and bad and rather
Yes.
approach them trying to understand what sort of experience is being described here. So, what sort of
Yeah.
experience is described by Mars in Taurus, Mars in Libra? I mean, maybe we move on to Sun in Aquarius now. We've been here for a minute, but like it's not
Yeah,
good or bad, it's just descriptive of a particular. And when it's in your birth chart, you have your
Yeah.
whole life to live this energy out. It's probably going to come through in multiple different ways as opposed to a transit, which would be
Yeah,
more temporary.
totally.
totally. And yeah, I mean, if we are moving on to Sun and Aquarius, um,
Who better?
hi.
Bring us
Yeah.
in.
Well, and what's funny is I actually love my Aquarius Sun. It's my Pisces Venus that I'm constantly like making fun of. And like, that's the placement that I would change if I had the ability to. So to be fair, like I actually think
Yeah, and I
I
love my Venus in Scorpio, honestly. I
right.
didn't 10 years
Really?
Sure.
ago, but now I do, you know, so.
Yeah.
But yeah, what's the sun in Aquarius doing? Who is she?
She's just vibing. I think there's a lot to be said about I guess I never really felt this is how I at least have interpreted and manifested it myself, but I've always felt like it was just this almost like I never felt like I needed to fit in. I never felt like I
Mm,
wanted to. I never felt like I needed to wear what my friends were wearing or do my makeup if my friends were doing their makeup. And this could have also maybe been my Aries moon stubbornness too, but like I didn't want to wake up early to look good in the morning in high school or whatever. Like I wanted to roll out of bed and be comfortable. And you know, I've always very much just wanted to be me, like without apologies about it. It's just like, no, this is what I'm doing. Come with me or don't. And yeah, it's always just kind of been like a I don't really care.
Mhm.
But also my son's in the 8th, so it's very like
and Saturn in Aquarius there
yeah,
is like
with Saturn.
really strengthening, like that's Saturnian Aquarian energy for you. But
Yes.
yeah, it's like if the sun is the center of the solar system and
Mhm.
then Saturn is the very edge of what we can see, and
Mhm.
Aquarius is like everything that's outside of the bounds of Saturn. Like I think of Aquarius as just like an astronaut floating out in
It's
space on
just
their
space.
own.
Yeah, it just is
Yeah,
deep
there's like it's
space.
very marginal, you know. So it's these two different energies of the sun wanting to like be this central organizing force and have things revolve around it. And then we
Yeah,
put it on the margins, but it's still the sun. Like it's bright and
right.
it like especially especially, you know, we talk about the dark house suns all the time, or the 12th and
Mhm.
8th house dark house suns, but like your
Totally.
sun is blinding, Lori, like right before
Right.
sunset, just like out in the 8th. But then it's like out floating in space, not trying to fit in the way that a sun in Leo is like, no, I have, like, my image is so important that I'm
Yeah.
perceived in this certain way, you know?
And I actually almost feel like, because I talk to other eighth house suns often, I think I attract that placement a lot in my readings. And I always talk about that like blinding people on the highway situation. And I always relate to people that way. And what I've actually noticed is when I bring that up, people tend to like care a lot more than I do about that. Like they'll be like, "I'm blinding people." And I'm like, "Yeah, isn't it fun?" Like and they're like, "No." I'm like, "Oh. You don't enjoy blinding people?" And yeah, it's almost this like, and I'm like, "Well, my son's in Detriment." That's like when it comes out, that's when I remember it's doing that. Because it is like very much like shining a reflection onto people. It's showing people their shadows. And so like I'm really comfortable with the dark shadows because I have a lot of Saturn. So like I already exist in the shadows. So I'm like, huh, does everyone want to talk about shadows? And then people are like, no, I really don't. And I'm like, oh, well, what's that like? So yeah, I feel like that's how it really comes out.
Mm.
It's weird because there's like this sort of like anti prom queenness about
Yeah.
Aquarius. But then I think about someone, well, I think about two things. One reference might be less um familiar, but if you've ever seen Heathers, it's like very clear like in groups and out
Hmm.
groups, and there's this like very kind of proud social outcast, but has his own sort of charisma and his own sort of gravitational pull. And the other thing I was going to talk about is Paris Hilton, who's an Aquarius sun. And again, like
Mm.
her, like she came to prominence for being like lazy, valley girl, vapid, like all the opposite of what we think of as solar, like having the ideal, the substance, the like consistency, the like authenticity. And
Yeah.
um she really like played on her um otherness to um create her brand.
Hmm.
That's so interesting.
And there is a bit of tallest poppy syndrome I see a lot with Aquarius suns, where it's like, again, over culture, how, you know, a planet in detriment or fall is often responded, it's often about how they're responded to. And it is often about that
Mm.
like desire to sort of like take them down a notch, or like, oh, you're too famous, or like you're famous for nothing. Or like you're,
Yeah.
see that with other planets in fall, or detriment
Mm-hmm.
too,
Hmm.
of like you're famous in the wrong way. Like
Mm-hmm.
we all acknowledge that you're famous, but we don't like why. It's like, oh, so
Yeah.
there's a right way and a wrong way. Cool, cool,
And
cool.
sometimes
Right.
that can be
Right.
one of the biggest ways that having a planet in detriment can be difficult is like you might be perfectly happy with the way you are, and then society is not happy with the way you are, and
Exactly.
then experiencing that planet in detriment as society coming at you and being hard on you, which especially depending on,
Hmm.
again, I'll just bring back the Hellenistic technique of looking at the houses
Mm-hmm.
ruled by the planet we're talking about. And the sun only rules one house,
Sure.
Leo. But, you know, if you have the sun in Aquarius and then Leo rules your 10th house, which can be your bosses, then maybe it's your boss who expects you to be a certain way. Or if Leo rules
Hmm.
your fourth house of family, maybe it's your family who expects you to be a certain way. And
Yeah.
so, like, the birth chart, like, the first house is you. And then the
Hmm.
rest of the chart is the world you interact with. And so, depending
Right.
on what houses the planets rule, like the difficulty of having that planet in detriment might be a certain group in society represented by either the planet's general signification or the house it's in charge of for your personal chart coming at you and saying that how you are is wrong and you need to be different, whether or
Yeah.
not you actually want to be different.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Well said.
Yeah. And I think there's definitely, my mom always kind of like made fun of me or like joked that I was very like stubborn as a kid. Like I would decide that I wanted my room to look different and she'd be like, "No, that wouldn't work. Like you can't do it that way." And then I would wake up at 3 a.m. and be like, "I'll show you." And I'll like rearrange my whole room. She would wake up and be like, "Huh, that fit." And I'd be like, "Yeah, told you." And it was just always this like, no, like I'm gonna just do it and prove it, you know? Like you might not think that my idea is correct or that like my vision is whatever, but it's like, no, this is the way I want it. So I'm just gonna do it this way and then I'll show you that it works. And then you'll believe me after I already do it, you know? And so I feel like I've always just kind of been that way, but I notice it a lot in other Aquarius suns as well, where there's just this like hint of, yeah, they told me it wouldn't work, so I did it and it worked.
Stephen Forrest talks about this in The Inner Sky, which, you know,
Mm,
I'm not like a modern astrologer, but that's such a classic, and I just love the way he um, puts images together in
yeah.
text. And he talks about Aquarius as like, yeah, it's like the person who really needs to figure out what they're rebelling against. Otherwise, they're just like wearing a leather jacket to the law office because.
Yeah.
Um, and it is that kind of thing where it's like, I don't want to fit in. And it's like, why? And it's like, I
Yeah.
don't know. I just
Oh,
don't.
just leave me alone.
Yeah, and just like needing a wheel to put that shoulder to, in a
Yeah.
sense, like needing a cause to rebel against.
Yes.
Mhm.
Yeah, I think about that a lot actually. Like that's so funny you say that, and that's a perfect way of describing that too, because like that was a lot of my childhood was me just like choosing hills to die on
Hmm.
and then just
Hmm.
being like, nope, this is gonna work. Like I'm doing this now. And then later being like, why did I even want to do that in the first place? Like I actually liked it better the way it was, but now I have to commit to this because I died on that hill. You know what I mean? Like it's just
Because the
Which
sun
can
is the ideal, and so Saturn is anti the ideal, and
right.
also the like, yeah, sort of the no.
And that also just connects
Yeah.
back to
Mhm.
what we were saying with your mediation is then if you
Yeah.
understand the nature of this, then you can choose the hill to die on that's
Right.
gonna like bring the energy through in the way that you like want it to in your life. Whereas if you're just dying on random hills, there might be some problems that come through if you're not like understanding why you feel compelled to do
Right.
that.
My
Yeah.
Aquarius ex would be like on Reddit, 9 p.m. I'd be like, sweetie, come to bed. And they'd be like, someone's wrong on the internet. I simply cannot, you know?
Well,
Yeah.
and so another thing that I think is so interesting with this is the sun just really does not like being in air signs, right? Because
Yeah.
Aquarius is an air sign, and then when we get to our fall
Libra.
episode, we'll talk about how the sun is in fall in Libra. And it's like the sun does so well in fire, like Leo and
Hmm.
Aries, where it's like domicile and exaltation places are fire, and the sun's like, look at me, look at what I
The
can
sun
do,
is
look at
fire.
these. Yeah, the sun is literally so,
It
Literally
and
literally.
it's
fire all the
like
way down.
and
Yeah.
then like the
Pure.
way that we express ourselves, that we express our
Right.
individuality and our personality, which is what the sun is doing in everyone's chart, like the sun prefers to do that through actions, and then you put it in an air sign and now it has to deal with like the social structures around it and
Hmm.
words and belief systems and
Yeah.
information, and there's just something, and that's like also like a shower thoughts thing to meditate on, is like, why does the sun
Totally.
not like being in air signs? But like, yeah, arguing on Reddit at 9 p.m. is like, the sun would be much better on like on stage than like a
Right.
Yes.
social media forum like that.
Yeah. Well, and I think the going into the mitigation thing, like that's a huge thing that I had to learn because I realized finally when I was like in high school, like why am I dying on random hills for absolutely no reason, right? Like this doesn't make sense. And that was kind of when I started questioning it. And then when I started understanding astrology, and understood my sun and what it was doing, I was like, okay. So now I'm very particular about the hills that I die on, but I also like very much hate conflict. And something I've noticed about myself is I either like care or I don't care. And if I don't care, I check out completely, won't even listen. Like I just, especially if it's
That's the
something I,
air. I always think about it as like the balloon floating away.
And
yes,
Like,
Aquarius can be like so
ah!
dissociated as an
Exactly.
energy.
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. And I've noticed that I do that to an extreme. Like if I'm invested in a friendship or a conversation, I'm 100% in. You have my whole attention. You have my whole heart. Like I'm here. But the second I like say, "Hey, please don't talk about this," and then you bring it up, I'm done. Like you are talking to a brick wall. Like I am creating entire villages in my brain right now. Like I am somewhere else completely. Like I don't even hear you. And it's almost scary how I can just like completely just shut down and disassociate and not even, yeah, not even here.
Hmm.
And so it's like, I think that's a big part of it too. It's
Mhm.
like the ability to just disassociate on the snap of a finger. Like it's just, okay, guy, I'm gone
Put
now.
it away. Yeah.
Yeah.
Should we do Venus?
Yeah, let's do Venus.
Yeah, so Venus is in detriment in Mars's signs, just like Mars is in detriment in Venus's signs. And so
Yes.
Venus in Scorpio and Aries. And yeah, honestly, just kind of continuing with like the inverse of Mars's things, right? If
Mm-hmm.
Venus signifies like cohesion and connectedness, bringing things together. Like my teacher, Kelly Surtees, will talk about like Kelly loves to bake, and she's like, if you have all the dry
Mm-hmm.
ingredients and then you add the wet ingredients that bring everything together, that's like a very Venusian energetic. And Venus wants to relax and experience pleasure and experience beauty. And then when Venus is in a sign ruled by Mars, like those, like Aries and Scorpio are very hardworking signs. They're signs that are
Mm-hmm.
really about, like, I really experience my Venus and Scorpio is like, I go after things a lot. Like, Venus is very good at
Mm-hmm.
magnetizing things and bringing things to her.
Mm-hmm.
And I pursue my desires. Like, Venus is your desire. And like, I'm very much about going after it, which sometimes can work really well. And then sometimes again, like it's not
Might
Venus
not.
is like she's in Mars's sex dungeon or like Mars's like fighting den, like given like a like
Mm.
knife when she wants to like bake cookies, she's not given the tools, but she wants to like bring things together and create
Yeah.
beauty and pleasure. Um, but yeah, people with like Mars year old Venuses can be like they can take a lot of action, they can be very hardworking, they can be really good at fighting for social justice. They might love in more unconventional ways. I've also experienced
Mm-hmm.
relationships just being more inconsistent in my life. Like I'll be in very long relationships. Like Venus and Scorpio is very, like Venus and Taurus loves stability and consistency, and she does get that in Scorpio. But then,
Mm-hmm.
like when planets are in detriment, what they're in charge of can experience inconsistencies. And so that can be like general things, like Venus is in charge of relationships for everyone, and then it can also be topical based on the houses that the planet rules. It's just that kind of inconsistency can come through as well.
I see Venus and Aries as being very much the like you have to keep up with me
Mm.
placement. Like I'm out here hiking, kayaking, like doing active stuff, and I need someone who's like on my level.
Yeah.
JP, who's the co runner of the erstwhile Portland School of Astrology, I remember they did a workshop on Venus, and they called Venus and Aries "get in the fucking car" energy. Like they're the person that pulls up. Yeah, they pull up outside your house at 8 a.m. Get in the fucking car, bitch! Like, get in, loser. We're going.
We're going
We're
shopping.
doing.
It is so real.
Yeah, we're
I
doing
have a good
something.
friend who has
Um,
Venus and Aries, and I met her on the ski hill, and like we rode the bus up together one day, and I'm like, "You want to ride together?" And she's like, where do you want to ride? And then I said the runs because she's like, I don't want to just go anywhere. And she's like, yeah, those are the runs I want to do. And then we skied together and she's just like goes and bombs and you just literally have to keep up with her. And it's like, it's so literal. Like Venus and Aries is like, because Aries is so
Bye.
independent.
Yeah.
Like
Yeah,
Aries is
right,
so
right.
independent. And then Venus is not, you know, she wants to be more like like interdependent is her ideal
Exactly.
way. But like, yeah, no,
Yeah.
they're gonna zoom off.
Yeah,
That's so
Venus and Aries is
funny.
very much, they're both, I think Venus and Scorpio too is very much like, let me take you to a spot. Let
Yeah.
me take you to a spot I know. And also it's interesting, I know a couple of artists with Venus and Aries, and that expresses itself very literally, where like they work in metal or like
Mm.
charcoal or both, where it's like,
Yeah.
yeah, like burnt ash and metal and fire, you
Like
know.
Mars materials.
Yeah, they like express their creativity through extremely Mars materials. I had a friend
Yeah.
actually who like was telling me that they met someone and that she had Venus and Aries, and I was like, oh, that might mean like a blacksmith or like a metal worker.
Yeah.
And he was like, oh yeah, yeah, she makes jewelry. Oh, that's weird. You know, but it's also like, you know, Venus traditionally, yeah, wants to like be the glue. But Mars is a drill. And so it's also a Venus that expresses itself very intensely, sometimes too intensely for other people, where it's like, you know,
Well, because Venus wants to like be on the surface. Like Taurus is like all the beautiful plants that are like on the surface of the earth, and then Mars, especially
and
like
Libra
with
is again, yeah,
Scorpio.
like Libra's the beautiful aesthetics and the
Yeah.
decor and the
And
like,
like
you know,
socially, if we're all just like talking about nice, good feeling surface level things, like that creates a like nice, cozy Venus type environment. And then yeah, Venus and Aries is like, let's talk about death, you know, or Venus and Scorpio. Either of them are like, yeah, they'll go to much more intense places than Venus would probably prefer in her own
you know who else is
signs.
Venus and Aries is like divas, like VH1 Divas Live, like Mariah Carey is Venus and Aries, Lady Gaga is Venus and Aries. Like there's a very like, I think Aretha Franklin might be Venus and Aries. So there's this very like don't like a very like,
Yeah.
again, a Venus that is like, I'm I'm in charge here.
Yeah.
Like I'm the star. I'm the star of this show. But also a Venus that's very like passionate. There's like this passion and this like, why don't you love me the way that I love you? Like why do I always feel so strongly? And again, it's a Venus that might associate love with, like, if you're not throwing plates at the wall, you know, getting complaints from the
Do you even
neighbors,
want it?
and
Yeah.
do you even want it? Like, yeah,
Right.
like there is a Love Island contestant. I'd love to do the Love Island. I love, as you know, I love reality TV astrology.
so
but there was
funny.
like a Love Island contestant that was like, if he doesn't make me low key want to go to the psych ward, like I don't want it. And it's like, yeah, not everyone wants that. Like, it takes,
But understanding,
you know,
like, if that's your
That's so
chart
funny.
and understanding that energy, and then, like, if we're sticking with the relationship analogy, like,
Yeah.
finding someone else who does actually want to throw plates at the wall and, like, like, I have a lot of Pluto in my chart, and, like, the people I'm closest with also have a lot of Pluto, and, like, if you don't want to go to, like,
the
I mean, we don't need to
underworld.
trauma dump all the time, but if you don't want to go to
Yeah.
Pluto places, like, I'm probably not going to
You're not
connect with you as much, and, like,
trying for
that's
total
okay.
annihilation. Yeah.
Like,
Yeah.
mutually assured destruction or
Yeah,
bust.
exactly.
Like-
Yeah.
Be like,
Right.
you have to go to the underworld.
We have to go now.
But just understanding, you know, these more unconventional manifestations in our charts, like, understand them and embody them and embrace them. Like, don't go out and like murder people or cause harm, but like,
Sure.
it's okay to like not be what's expected of you. And that's where detriment planets are really an invitation to live into that.
Yeah.
And I think Scorpio Venus, like, I always think about, like, and I don't know if this is his placement or not, but I think about like Alexander McQueen or Rick Owens, or like beauty that's really masculine or masculinized, and like it's a lot of black, again, like red Mars, black Mars, the Jason Hawley kind of thing with the Mars ruled signs, and how like Venus in Scorpio has this like, or both, there's like an almost there's their tomboyishness or an androgyny or a off kilter femininity, like a different flavor um than you're used to.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
It's like aesthetics that are not as like conventionally accepted would be
Yes.
Venus in Detriment for sure.
Like I
Yeah.
have a Venus and Aries friend who's like a very goth, like in a Edwardian
Mm.
like kind of way. You know what I mean?
I
Like
love
school
that.
heel boots and corsets kind of way. Like
I
it's
love that.
really beautiful and Venusian, but in this extremely like dark,
Aries one.
macabre Aries way.
That's so funny. Um, yeah, and with Venus and Scorpio, my best friend has that, and I've noticed I attract a lot of clients with it too, for sure. I like
My spouse has
know
Venus and Scorpio, so.
yeah, I attract so many Venus and Scorpio people and I love it. But I've noticed there's like a pattern with most of them that like they have this fear that their partner's gonna die.
Mm.
And there's like a crazy, like it's actually kind of a crazy fear. Um, but I think for my best friend, like she didn't date for a long time because of that subconscious fear. She was like, well, what if they like die? And then right after we had a long conversation about that, like 5 years ago, I remember like one of my first astrology clients had Venus in Scorpio, and I was like, "Do you feel like your partner's gonna die?" Like I just like had to know if like other Scorpio Venuses felt this way. And she was like, "Oh yeah. Like anytime he leaves the house, I text him to make sure he hasn't died yet." And I was like, "Oh." And so then I started asking that question to like all Scorpio Venuses. And yeah, every single one were like, yeah, they're gonna do it one day. Like that's gonna happen. I was like, that's such a
Fears. I mean, Mars
yeah,
definitely
that's
has to
such a
do with
weird thing.
fears, and then fears
Hmm.
related to relationships, intimacy, these Venusian topics, and then Scorpio,
Yeah.
especially with just being associated with death.
Oh, totally. Yeah. Yeah,
Another
and it
thing,
can be
oh
a
no, keep going.
debilitating fear too. No, that's it.
Totally. Yeah, because these planets are debilitated,
Literally.
literally is a word, so it, can be quite difficult.
Quite literal.
Um, Another thing that this conversation is making me think of, because like with my Venus and Scorpio, I've looked at so many different, like, okay, well, is this a remediating factor, like from technical considerations? And
Mm,
so
Yeah.
some things just in general, if you have a planet in detriment, you can look for is looking at like well, I guess we can start with looking at what planet rules that planet and how they're doing. So if you have Venus, Mars in Scorpio, or like Lori has her sun in detriment and
Mhm.
Aquarius, but then she also has Saturn and domicile there. So like there might be some help if the planet
Yeah.
who is in charge of your planet in detriment is in good condition.
Hmm.
Also you can look to the exalted planet. So like Mars in Taurus, like look to the moon and see what the moon's doing because the moon exalts in Taurus. And then we will, I'm sure at some point, get into minor dignity like triplicity and bounds and these other
yeah,
minor
that's something
forms of
I
dignity.
don't
But like
know a ton about, but
Hmm.
Venus in Scorpio has triplicity because Venus has triplicity in water and earth signs.
yes.
Yeah.
And so like Venus in Scorpio has a little more dignity than Venus in Aries, which even just makes
Yeah.
sense. Like Venus and water, like water is
Yeah.
very connective and brings things together, whereas Aries is so dry. And then you can also look at the bound lord of your planet, and especially, maybe we can also kind of shift into Mercury because, like, Brene
Yeah, sure.
Brown is an example that Kelly
Mm,
Surtees uses a ton
mhm.
in teaching
Hmm.
examples. That Brene Brown is a Sagittarius rising with Mercury rejoicing in the first house in Sagittarius. So Mercury in detriment, opposing Jupiter in Gemini, also in detriment. But then
Mm.
Mercury is in its own bounds. And like we just need to do a whole episode on this because like minor dignity just gets kind of like
It
nutty
can
and
get
stuff.
very, yeah, it gets real, yeah.
It gets really
Yeah.
granular. But if you have a planet in its own bounds, it might have been Manilius. It was definitely an ancient astrologer who said that that can be as good as a planet in its own sign. And so, like, Brene Brown
Mhm.
is an example. She's dedicated her life to understanding disordered thinking patterns, right? So, Mercury
Hmm.
in detriment, but then she has like so much like power and energy and
Mm-hmm.
visibility and like a good job, and like her TED Talk is like one of the biggest TED Talks ever. And so it's like Mercury being in its own bounds gives it
Yes.
like, it's like the planet who rules the sign is like the principal. So if we're talking about Sagittarius, Jupiter is the principal of Sagittarius, but the bound ruler or the term ruler, which are the same thing, is like the teacher. And so if Mercury's in its own bounds in Sag, then it's like its own teacher in a
It's
classroom. And
mentoring
so it,
itself to maximize its
yeah,
potential.
so it
Yeah.
like has
Totally.
to deal with Jupiter as the principal, but teachers have a lot of autonomy in their classrooms. So just kind of to like whet your palate on all the different ways and on nuances of detriment planets can actually function really well, and looking at all of the forms of dignity can
Yeah.
help
Mm-hmm.
from a technical standpoint.
And
Yeah.
I'd say also that like think about other forms. Like again, like a Mercury in Sagittarius may not be the best copy editor,
Mm-hmm.
but they might be a really talented musician. Like they're translating communication into a different form. In fact, there are a lot of like really
Sure.
well-known musicians that have um Mercury in Sagittarius.
Mm.
Um
Well, and I have a really good friend with Mercury and Pisces who's literally engineer who, had to work so hard to like become a really good engineer, but they're an engineer specifically for audio engineering and like making
mm,
speakers better to bring more sound into existence, like through
waves.
technology.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. I've known a couple engineers who work with ZR or VR, not ZR. Wow.
Mm.
That's where my brain's at. Um
Someday.
someday. But no, like with virtual reality. But they're like
Mm.
engineers specifically.
With
And
Mercury
so
and Detriment.
yes, with
Yes.
Mercury
Okay.
and Pisces. Yeah, sorry. I was like ZR, yes, that's where my brain is.
And poets
Um
too. I've
Poets, Maya
Poets,
a lot of
for
Angelou,
sure.
that like Venus, Mercury, and Pisces, like Maya Angelou,
they
making things
break
really, really
language. They
beautiful.
like remake
Yes.
Hmm.
it in their image and you know and poets again, over culturally speaking, poets tend to be denigrated like
Mm-hmm.
by
Hmm.
Western cultural hegemony, like doesn't really value poetry.
Sure.
Um, but
Well,
we
and
do
we do here. We love poets
here, we do
in
in
this
this
space.
house.
In this house.
But I also feel like one thing I love asking people is like, what do they think in? Like, do they think in words or images? Because my Mercury's in Libra, conjunct the
Mm.
ascendant and the North Node and square Uranus, and I'm like words constantly. Like, there are always words coming through my brain with that air sign, like Mercury with all its crazy aspects. And whenever I ask my friends with Mercury and Pisces or Sag, I feel like they always say images. Like, it's like you're thinking in
Mhm.
images, and then it might be harder
Mhm.
like if I ask a friend like what are you thinking about and they have Mercury and Sag, it's like really hard for them to actually like what are the
Put words to it.
words, which is like Mercury kind of struggling because Mercury wants words, but it's like what's the richness of thinking in images or thinking
Mhm.
in sounds or colors or like a different way than like words.
Or think about someone like Grimes. Like to me, like Grimes is a really great example of someone with Mercury and Pisces who makes this music that's like very ethereal and feels like it's tapping into something. But when she's interviewed or when you talk to her, there's like a real split on like, is she a genius or is she an idiot? Like,
Mm.
and I think there's like I think Mercury in domicile and exaltation, like even if it's like Gemini is never an idiot. Gemini's a clown, but there's a very different jester is not an idiot. Like, but there's a this idea of like, and when I say idiot too, there's like this idea of a mm, naivety
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, whereas
in
Mercury
Jupiter
doesn't like to
signs.
be naive. Mercury
Mhm.
wants to like know everything and be connected to everything and have the facts and have the, and it's like
Yeah.
continuing with, you know, if Jupiter is this big gas planet who wants to like make meaning and look at the big picture, if you have Mercury in detriment, or when Mercury is in detriment by transit, then like you might be like typing out a big website and just not be very good at copy editing it and like finding all the little typos because you're like, no,
Mhm.
but the picture, like the big thing, like
Yeah.
that's what I'm focused on, when Mercury would prefer to be more granular and really get down to the like the tiny details.
I think about it
Yeah.
as like Mercury in its domicile, Mercury in its own signs. It's like down in the village, like whispering or like handing out the newspapers, whereas Mercury in Jupiter signs is like on the balcony, um, making the kind of big speech, the big pronouncement.
Yeah.
And like
And
some people are locked in and some people are like, look at that windbag. Like that doesn't even make any sense.
yeah.
They're just saying words that sound profound.
And going back to the like poetry conversation, um, when I was doing some research on the muses for my book,
Oh,
um,
beautiful.
yeah, almost all of the muses were the muse of this kind of poetry and then the muse of that kind
Yes.
of poetry. And like I just remember thinking like, why are they all just different types of poetry? So I like started digging a little deeper into like a little bit more of that answer.
Mm-hmm.
And what I basically found was that back in those times, like poetry basically was their only type of like entertainment.
Mm.
Because if you think about it, they didn't really have like books, they didn't have TV, they didn't have radio, they didn't have like really anything. They just created
Like epic
music, they
poems. Yeah.
created poems, they created whatever, and that's how most of their writing was done. And so there were just a bunch of different types of poetry being the different muses. And I think in more modernized society, like the muses have kind of split off into other things and like created newer significations. But even like the muse of like basically the religious one is like religious hymns. Like it's literally like
Mm-hmm. Well,
Or
like even
lyric
that's
or
poetry.
epic or yeah.
Yeah, like lyrical hymns or poet what yeah, it's just all of the different types. But I just thought that was like really interesting when I found that in some research because like, yeah, we don't really talk about poetry much in today's society, but that's like kind of where we came from. And that's really all
Yes.
they
yeah.
had back then. So,
Unless
and
And
Twitter's poetry.
its own version.
sure. I don't have a
But
Twitter, but sure.
it's like
Um,
Mercury in detriment is the storyteller, is like there's something
right.
so mythic about Jupiter's
Mm-hmm.
signs in general, and then Mercury in a Jupiter ruled sign is like so mythic, and it makes me think of like the
Yeah.
debate back in the time of Socrates over the development of the pen as technology, and what does
Yeah.
that do
Mm.
with information if people can write it down rather than having to remember it and recite it through
Wow.
story. And there's something so like Mercury in detriment about communication before you could write it down. Like the oral tradition is so like Mercury in detriment in its own way.
And that makes so much sense too.
I wonder if there's Mercury and Pisces and photography as well, or like image making,
Mm.
like the opposite,
Yeah.
like just breaking it down to like words opposite Mercury
Yeah.
words
And
opposite photo image, or
yeah, and I just had this thought too that like I guess if you had to remember all of it, then poetry is such a great way to remember it.
Mm-hmm. And
Like
story.
rhyme
in
and rhyme
storytelling,
and
right? Like in
lyric.
yeah, putting it in ways that rhyme or um sound aesthetically pleasing almost. Like that's gonna be way easier to remember. Like because you get songs stuck in your head all the time. Like it's so much easier to remember those things. So once again, going back to like if you don't have a pencil and paper or pen or whatever you're writing with, like you don't have the ability to write it down, then like a whole book, you're not going to remember that, but
Mm-hmm.
a poem, you will.
Yeah.
That's such an interesting. Yeah, thought.
Yeah, thinking about, well, and just from, I mean, the definition of history literally is like
Yeah.
since written word. And it's
Mhm.
so easy for us to think that humans have only existed for a few thousand years because that's all we have written record of. But like when you think back on like the hundreds of thousands of years of human history and how oral that is and how ingrained that is into like how we evolved, and like even like people loving to watch TV at night, that's because like our ancestors would come around the hearth at night and tell each other stories, and there's
Yeah.
something just like so like ancient in us about wanting to share
Well, and then it was
stories
the
in that
radio,
way.
and it was like
Hmm.
stories, teleplays on the radio before it was TV. Like,
Yeah.
Should we do the
oh, that's
moon?
a good,
Oh,
that's an
here,
interesting
go.
Mercury in Detriment. It's like War of the Worlds, when they did War of the Worlds on the radio, and people that tuned in late thought it was real and that aliens were really attacking Earth, and everybody freaked the F out. That really
That's so
happened.
funny.
That is really funny. Was Mercury in detriment by transit when that happened?
I should check that. Like, when
Like,
did War
what's the
of the
chart?
Worlds premiere?
That would be so funny. Because it
um
probably was. That feels right.
But yeah,
Right.
if you have Mercury in detriment, like give yourself permission to get a bookkeeper. Like don't force yourself to do all the
Yes.
Mercury things, and like
Wow,
enjoy
yeah.
like the poetry or whatever. You know, understand
Yeah.
where your strengths and weaknesses are, and we don't all have to be good at everything. Although our Mercuries might want us to be, depending on the condition.
Yeah. I mean, I feel that way too. Like, because I feel like I'm a really good writer, but I am not an editor.
Mm.
Like, I need to have so many people read over everything I write because I'm like, there might be no punctuation in there. I don't know. Like, I'm not good at that part. I don't pay attention. That part's boring.
Well, should we do the moon? Wrap up?
The
Yeah.
moon.
The
Oh,
moon.
the moon in
Capricorn.
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 I feel like the moon, the moon being like our bodies and what our bodies need to be cared for. And if Cancer is like this very restful, nourishing, supportive, connective place, the moon in
Mm.
Capricorn just feels like it needs to work all the time to make sure its resources are made. And literally in medical astrology, Kira Sutherland will teach that when the
Yeah.
moon by transit is in Capricorn, our bodies don't absorb things as well. So if you're trying to take medicines
Yeah.
and stuff and you're trying to time
Oh.
it, like the moon in
Yep.
Capricorn would be worse than like the moon in Cancer can absorb things better. And it's like, it's just hard for the moon and the things the moon signifies to like as far as like nourishment and sustenance and connection. Like Capricorn's like, okay, but how are we going to pay our bills? Like, what's this like grand plan that we're
Mhm.
working on for 40 years, And it's hard on the body to do Capricorn things.
And rejects
Yes.
comfort is like, don't you
Yes.
dare, don't you dare try to give me any like good food, good sleep, good mothering. Like, it's the
Mhm.
Jason Hawley always talks about Capricorn is like the nanny goat. Like, it's like tough,
Yeah.
it's tough love.
Well,
Like, if that's your inner parent, it's a very tough parent. And if it's
Yeah.
your inner child, it's a very terrifying child.
Yeah.
mm,
Well,
It's
and
a
yeah,
child that
leaning.
is like, don't hug me, ew, don't, no, I'm good.
Yeah.
It's a
mhm.
child that like, yeah, they're a picky eater.
Mhm.
Um, it's a child that maybe has sleep problems, that
They're like
maybe,
kind of cold energetically
Mhm.
with others,
Yeah.
but they might take over the world someday because they're very hardworking. Depending
Yes.
on the aspects and the moon phase and the house placement, but
Sure.
a moon in
Yeah.
Capricorn can definitely be hardworking.
Well, and Moon in Capricorn, I always think of like the child that had to raise themselves.
Hmm.
Like, didn't really, it's not necessarily, I mean, totally depends on the chart because it is this way for probably most of them. But it's almost like having parents that weren't there, either physically or emotionally, or, whether or not they like meant to be that way either. They might have cared, but they might have had to work
Hmm.
and just like couldn't physically be there as much as they wanted to be for whatever reason,
Yeah.
right? And so However, that manifests, like I have a friend who it's like the youngest of a million siblings and has moon in Capricorn, and it's just like sh- she just had so many siblings that like she just didn't really get the attention because she had one sibling that had some health issues, and it just was like that was the sibling that needed the attention. Like when there's like 12 others, you
Mhm.
don't need it. And so it's just almost this like, well, I have to be self-sufficient because I need to be, right? Like because I'm not being babied, I'm not being taken care of. And I always think of Capricorn energy as like Benjamin Button. like like they age backwards. Like it's a very serious child who like grows up very quickly and like has to take care of themselves. But then I always notice the switch, like a 30 something Capricorn moon specifically, but like Capricorn stellium especially, like that is the most chaotic person you'll ever meet, right? Like the Capricorn who finally like realized, why am I so serious? Like why have I been this way my whole life? I actually don't want to be this way anymore. And then they just 180, like they become so much fun and just so like crazy and chaotic because they're like, I was so serious. Why was I so serious? Like, I finally feel okay. I finally have money. I finally, and it's that Saturn energy too of like, oh, after my Saturn return, this isn't so bad. It's like I can finally breathe now.
Mm. Yeah, it's funny. I stayed at a friend's house, like house sat for them while they were out of town, and I had never like been in their home before.
Mm.
And it was one of those times where I had to like race to their birth chart because I was like, wow, this home is just like so organized. Like everything is exactly like it flows and like everything is on its little peg. And I like raced to the birth chart, and like of course they had a Capricorn moon,
Mm.
and it's like it's not like it wasn't a particularly like cozy home,
Yeah,
but it was an extremely well organized home, and everything was like within
in its
reach and
place.
like needed to be was where it needed to be, and like made a lot, like did a lot with a little bit of space.
Mm.
And I feel like that's like the really matured like like expression of Capricorn moon is like private space that is again resourced, very well resourced in a way that works, that's for them.
Hmm.
And it's hard because again Capricorn is sort of about that ascent up the mountain to the guru, to the perspective, to wherever that it is they're going, like leaving the village and taking the climb. And that's opposite Cancer and the moon, which is like down in the village harvesting and doing the dancing and flirting and fucking, and so it's like when everybody else is having those Cancerian impulses, the Capricorn moon wants to seek something else, wants to leave and seek something else.
Yeah.
Well said.
Hmm.
Well, should we wrap up? Any final thoughts?
Just gratitude.
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, what do you have going on, Hannah?
Oh, well, if you're in Portland, I'll be reading at a drag show on the 10th. This might publish after that. I will also be I'm creating a sound piece for an upcoming art installation, time-based art project. If you want to keep up with my various doings, and here's a fun thing: if you have old or busted Crocs or like flat form Croc offs that you haven't thrown away, I would love to take them off your hands, and you can follow me on Instagram to find out where to donate. And my Instagram handle is going to be in the show notes. That's like a fun side quest I'm working on, is collecting old busted Crocs for a special side quest project. Yeah.
I love that.
What about you, Lori?
Yeah. Just been writing a lot. Been really excited about this book and being able to share all these asteroid stories. So yeah, I'll just put that out again. If you have any asteroid stories that are personal or anything that you want to share, I'm trying to just collect a ton of like case studies and stories and resources and just like share how they manifest in people's like real lived experiences, real lives. And so as well as like telling the mythology, the story, the lessons, um, just all the things that you would need to know about each of the asteroids, but I'm trying to include as many as possible. So pretty much any story that you might have, even if it's just about people's names or just like cool things. I'm even doing a chapter on like how names manifest. And if the name itself isn't relevant, I've been keeping that anonymous um, just to tell the stories and show how it all works out. So that's been super fun to receive stories and talk to people and yeah, and I've been doing asteroid readings and everything too. So all of that. And then otherwise just doing regular readings too and just hanging out until we head off to Greece.
What about you, Alicia?
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just kind of plugging along with the same stuff. So I also offer asteroid astrology readings and just regular topical astrology readings. I do like mini ones, 30 minutes to just talk about one topic, all the way up to 90 minutes. And then herbal astrology readings as well, because I'm an herbalist, so I can incorporate in herbal information and knowledge to things that are important to you when we talk about your astrology. And then I also have a blog on my website that's linked down below with information on ancestral veneration and plant communication. And I've been working on this really long collection of Materia Medica posts about various herbs and their medicinal virtues for the herb school I went to. And so if you want to learn about calendula or rosemary or hibiscus, or at this point I've written about over 2 dozen herbs, and so you can find that information in my blog as well, because it's hard to find accurate and reliable information about herbs online. And I do a lot of research in books with well-respected herbalists, and then I have my herb teacher review all of the posts, so they're pretty well vetted for accuracy, and they're just a great place to be like, whoa, I didn't realize that calendula, like I had knee surgery and I've been using calendula on my incisions and it's really healing the scar tissue.
Beautiful.
And so, working with herbs can be really, really helpful. And like rosemary is literally like, if you just used rosemary for everything, you'd probably be good. Like there's so much that rosemary can use. So like pretty cool to learn about herbs.
Oh,
And yeah, just working on that project. So yeah.
yeah.
Thanks so much for having me again, y'all. It's always a
Yeah,
pleasure.
thanks,
Thanks for
Hannah.
coming back.
All right, and thanks to everyone for being with us through this whole episode. We'll see you guys soon.